In business, the appreciation of the fact that how a consumer sees a business affects that all-important buying behavior and loyalty has spawned the environment we see today, in which businesses are protective of their brands and invest in corporate social activities to strengthen positive perceptions of their operations. In countries even as far away as Grenada, policymakers argue that the media can even influence investor confidence. One scholar argues that the media, due to its financial relationship with financial markets and through the intensified and overly value-laden coverage of the financial woes of Greece, contributed to the evaporation of trust by investors in an entire economy. How do we ensure that the news media perform their clearly powerful function well? And what happens when our view of the world and events is skewed by unethical practices and unprofessionalism by some in the very industry that informs this view? We address these questions tonight. I am Nameto Sibina. Welcome to First Issues. Last week, we looked into the difficult relationship between the news media and the corporate world and discovered that there may be some fundamental challenges to the way our local media operates. Inconsistencies that are creating elements of mistrust between such an important element of a thriving society and the people it is meant to serve.
We sometimes just ask ourselves whether the media has an agenda against business or for business.
They have a way of sensationalizing stories. If you walk to go and buy a paper, you will first look at the headline, always. And you'll find something attracts you. And when you pick up the paper, the story on the headline is different from the one that is inside.
In light of these perceptions, my co-presenter Shadi Lenzwe approaches members of the news media to hear their side of the story.
The public is really on us these days. The criticism that is coming from the public is overwhelming as we speak. Some believe that even the ethics, we've thrown them out of the window.
Do you think that the public's criticism is justified or is it unfounded?
I would say in some cases it's founded. Yeah, it's justified. I would be quick to point out that, that certain elements in the industry who, in some cases, tend to lose the grip, especially on the issue of ethics.
Business accused the media of being unethical. But what is even more interesting is that within the media industry itself, there are also divisions over ethics and professionalism between private and government media houses. The public broadcaster is accused of pushing a one-sided agenda and of sometimes even suppressing stories that are of public interest to protect prominent figures in our economy. We took these queries all the way to the Ministry for Presidential Affairs and Public Administration and spoke to Mohomuti Kabaya Mudimo, Deputy Permanent Secretary in Information and Broadcasting.
The private media has at times accused state-owned media of ignoring ethics, media ethics, and generally suppressing stories of public interest. Do you think that perhaps there's something we don't understand about the mandate of state-owned media?
I always prefer to speak to specific case examples because then we are able to speak specifically. Recently, there was this story of Tswana Pride chickens because it is the most recent issue that came in the private media where we were accused of stifling or gagging a story that was deemed to be of public interest, where it was assumed we had no reason not to air the story the first instance we met it. Well, in that particular instance, we acted as any professional, ethical, conscious media house should, which is as soon as you have a story idea or a story in fact, the basic principles of journalism is first of all to confirm the accuracy of the report, to ensure that everybody involved in the particular story is given a chance, an opportunity to be heard or to say their side. And in our case, the day the story broke and the day our colleagues elsewhere reported on it, we hadn't had all the facts about the story. So we decided that it would be incorrect to air a one-sided version of the story. And further to that, the facts or information that we had at the time called for further investigation to confirm what was being suggested. So sometimes I think when a media house accuses the other or views the other as lacking in any one of the basic fundamentals of journalism, accuracy, truthfulness, fairness, and so forth, for me the right thing to do is to ensure that you understand all factors around the particular issue. And of course, media houses will never report exactly the same way about any one particular issue. Every media outlet, as you would expect, takes a particular angle and a particular viewpoint in any given story. So we believe as government media, our position is quite clear. Our mandate and purpose is to project, to publicize government information and facilitate interaction between Botswana and government by way of truthful, accurate, and verified and confirmed reporting. And that's how we operate.
Should there really be a difference between private media and state-owned media in terms of executing their mandate?
I think in terms of presenting news reports or news stories factually and correctly, refraining from representing personal opinion as fact, there should be no difference between state media and private media in that regard. Perhaps the difference will obviously be shaped largely by the agenda of the shareholders of a particular media house. As you know, media is owned by someone. We are owned by government. The private media is owned by someone there who sets the parameters of what they stand to represent. So perhaps the differences will come in the way we treat stories in terms of positioning, in terms of, in the case of the printed press, perhaps pictures that should support or carry a story. But in terms of the basics of journalism, ethics, reporting, confirming stories, not rushing to print or broadcast before you have verified everything, you know, the rules are the same.
Do you ever feel let down by members of your profession?
I would admit, yes, sometimes it happens. You know, sometimes you see a story, you read that story, you realize that maybe one or two of the subjects in the story, you know, were unfairly treated by such a news report.
There are many times where even myself, I do complain to them. Even as an organization as MISA, sometimes we do have wrangles on how these issues were handled. And when we come down to interacting with them, discussing with them, we see the wrongs and the rights, and we hope that they learn from them. But I think what to me I find unacceptable is shoddy work. I don't think it's acceptable for professionals to do shoddy work. There are many journalists in our media houses who have been working for 10, 15 years. They should have learned on the job, not to make mistakes that they were making when they were budding journalists. So I am worried about that. And I think we cannot run away from the fact that there are times when you just want to kick whatever is in front of you when you see the shoddiness and the lack of professionalism that comes out in some of the stories. And that is not acceptable.
Could it be that the shoddiness that Ramapangane is so irked by can be traced to the very institutions that produce our journalists? Shadi interrogates Professor Rooney, head of media studies at the University of Botswana, on the matter.
What do you teach your media students in order to mold them into being true media professionals?
Well, we teach ethical codes of conduct. It's very important, and not only do we teach them how to write a story and such like, but we put it in the broader context of society. And one of the things that we do is that we look not only at newspaper standards, if you like, here in Botswana, but also at international standards. And we try to do some comparisons about whether or not we think what the local newspapers here are doing are the sorts of things that are generally acceptable to people here, but also in the international kind of community of journalism, if you like.
We all go to the same schools and some even the same class. Where do we get it wrong?
As I alluded to earlier, we will find that we generally agree on the definition of the principles that guide the practice of journalism. And as we say, we probably go to the same schools because journalism, remember, is normally taught as an applied art. That means it is taught by people who practice it, the professionals who will come to schools in the evenings or whatever time they have to come and teach what they do. And then you learn as you work. You know, this is why people get attached to newspapers, they get attached to radio stations, they get attached to TV stations over a long period of time. But I think there is probably different environments under which you operate in terms of the extent to which a country or a given area builds and retains your veterans or people who have stayed with the profession over a period of time. If you watch some of the major, on the broadcasting side, news outlets, you find out that the presenters and the editors are quite advanced in age. There are people who are in their 60s, their 70s and so on. Moharona, you find that some of the editors and people who hold the key to what goes out there into print or on air are young in age and therefore young in experience. So I think one of the weaknesses that we need to find means of addressing together, the private media and government media, is to build a resource base of mentors who are experienced in this profession. There is a danger to tend to assume, or anybody who can put pen to paper can become an editor of a paper or a radio station of news. That takes many, many years of practice and experience. And I think in Botswana we still lack that. You know, you can mention a few names of elders who founded this profession, and you find out most of them are in retirement. And I think to a large extent lost to the profession because you don't see them in our newsrooms, mentoring youngsters, assisting them to get to know what it takes to become a true son of this profession. So I think we need to do something about mentorship, you know, making use of those who came before us, who are still alive today, in comparison to what they do elsewhere.
For you to be called a reputable journalist, you must try by all means to balance whatever you give out to the people. You are in there as a public servant. All journalists, all media people, they are public servants because they are in there for the interest of the public. For you to call yourself somebody who's working for the interest of the public, you must be somebody who's fair, somebody who depends more on facts all the time, somebody who's always willing to give the other party a side to be heard, somebody who's always willing to be criticized, to be scrutinized by the wider public that consumes his or her work. So I believe that for you to, get that notch from the public, it has to come from the public. You will never endorse yourself as a reputable journalist. It has to come from the public or from the people who consume your work.
The other thing is, the trade of journalism tends to have a thin line between that and politics. There are some in the trade who then want to behave like political commentators, where every story is given some political twist or political shade to it, even when there isn't such. At the School of Journalism, we are taught things like libel, defamation, slander, all sorts of things. And you are also taught a generalist view of economic and political issues so that you get a broad base of grappling with issues when you report about them. And this is why later in life, there are things called beats, or an area or a field in which you report. I think one of the things also that we need to cultivate in Botswana, that I don't believe personally we have done a good job in there, is to train our journalists to report on beats, to specialize in areas where they spend time, years and years, learning and making sure that they are properly informed and schooled, well schooled in the field in which you report. But because we tend to want to report on anything that we run into, sometimes it comes through in the stories that, you know, there's very weak or thin background in the case of the reporter on what they are reporting about.
Do you ever sometimes feel let down by some of your products or former students?
I don't think it's about being let down by any individual. You know, we may say, oh, we taught them very well at the university and they got high marks and now they're working on a newspaper somewhere and, oh, we're reading what they're writing but we're not very happy with it. Because often as not, it's not the individual journalist's fault that something goes wrong. For example, you know, an individual journalist might be required by his or her newspaper to do a dozen stories in a week, you know. Sometimes you don't have the time to do the stories properly. So what journalists the world over do is you do the best that you can do in the time available and hand it in, and that's what gets printed. So we shouldn't be really harsh on the ex-student and say, oh, I didn't like that and it's all your fault.
How is it that the institution that is supposed to show society its problem areas seems to report very little on its own flaws?
One of the reasons for not doing so in public, I would say, is that there comes times when the press needs to stick together if there's some external threat to the press. And by that I mean maybe a government might be wanting to attack the press in some way or another. Not necessarily in Botswana, but this is the case the world over. Then the press needs to come together in order to see off that threat. Yeah. Now, if you've got a press that's bickering amongst itself in its own columns all the time, there's no, the solidarity isn't there. Yeah. So the solidarity is important. If you've got arguments amongst each other, you know, talk about them in the pub, even talk about them in your offices. Go to the office of the offending publication. Don't make it public. Keep it private.
It is internationally accepted that the news media are meant to keep themselves accountable through the use of a self-regulatory framework. We next explore how this facet of the industry is meant to work.
The media in Botswana is self-regulatory, and this is done through the Press Council of Botswana. When a reader out there reads a story and determines that this story is not fair to his or her reputation somehow, and it mentions him or her in bad light, something which she feels she could have been given an opportunity to answer for herself or himself, she can make a report to the Press Council of Botswana. When the matter has been adjudicated upon and the newspaper or whatever publication it was is found to have infringed on the rights of the complainant, there is a ruling that is made, and that ruling in most cases, the newspaper can be asked to apologize, the newspaper can be asked to give the person a right of reply, that person, and it has to be something which has been agreed upon by the complainant, and you know, it has to be given the same prominence. That is where we've been having the biggest challenge, actually, the issue of prominence, because usually when the objectionable story is on the front page or on, you know, prime pages like page 2, 3, it's very difficult to convince newspapers to carry the same you know, rebuttal on the prominent pages.
How long does it take to process a complaint at the Press Council?
In the past, it would take a matter of weeks, 2 to 3 weeks. As we speak, I'm aware of about three complaints which have been at our table for almost 6 months now, because we had challenges in the recent past. But I'm happy that today we've actually sorted out the problem, and the complaints committee is active now.
You mentioned that some publishing companies refuse to print these rebuttals even after the findings of the Press Council. What does this say about the integrity and the commitment to these ethics?
Without beating around the bush, it just shows that they're not committed to the Press Council. They're not committed to the self-regulatory framework itself. But we always share with them that your attitude actually is calling on government to take over.
How can the service delivery of the Press Council be improved?
The Press Council is a voluntary organization. You see, there are times when there would be people who sit in the Media Complaints Committee, but because of other problems that they may be having, whether it's as a result of where they're working or just this other things that they would feel that they can't have time for the Press Council. Some people just drop out, and sometimes you find that committee can't even form a quorum to sit and deliberate on a matter that is before them. So I think for me it's going to be a little difficult to say what needs to be done.
I think one of the improvements I would suggest to the Press Council of Botswana is to be as inclusive as possible. That is representing both the private and government media and our experienced mentors and veterans who may not necessarily be in practice, such that we can define the commonality of issues we see and how best to treat them. Listen, at the end of the day, all of us report about this country, Botswana, and as some have said, we have only one country, and none of us loves it better than the other, so to speak. And it behooves us as the media to present an image of this country that we would like to be associated with. And we can only do that effectively if we are correctly informed, if we treat each other with respect, regardless of what house we represent. The whole objective of effective and professional journalism is to represent maturity, to inform our viewers as accurately as we can, so that we can engage. So I think the more a larger number of us make an input into the works of the Press Council, the better we stand a chance to lay the parameters and assist this profession to behave in a manner expected of a mature sector, a key sector of this economy.
It was our intention tonight to give both the consumer and industry leaders a better understanding of the problems plaguing our local media industry. One first has to identify the problems before we can begin to properly address them. We hope that this is only the beginning of a very necessary conversation, and thank our guests for their candidness in discussing these issues. From me, Nameto Sibina, my co-presenter Shadi Lintswe, the team behind First Issues, and our sponsors First National Bank, we wish you a good night and pleasant viewing.